after that he had been marked as a traitor by the unified Earth government. John had realized that he couldn't go back to Earth or even his home planet. It's because of United Nations Space Command, because they would have a lookout for him on Earth and even his home planet. And he knows that they would have sent out their best tracking team to track him down. So John had to be on a constant moving all the time. He only stayed on New World for a short time, for like a few days at most. But thanks to his extensive knowledge of galaxy, of major worlds, which world has the most high military presence, so he avoided those. He preferred to go to the smaller colonies that would have a small or even non-military presence at all, since he preferred to be using his suit. But he knows that he have an advantage. If he walked around in the general public on those worlds without his suit, none of the general public would even know him, because most of the general public probably has seen him with his suit. But so if he didn't use his suit, that would give him at least some freedom and also advantage. But he never let his guard down, because sometimes when he were on a colony world, he knows that there could have been a small or maybe some military presence on their planet, and he didn't know if any of those military officers could have recognized him or something. So he preferred to just stay away from major colonies and from even major military presence. He knows that if he would somehow run into military officers that could recognize him, he knows his life would have been end. He would have been brought back to Earth for execution. So he preferred to just stay low for many times. And even being on a constant movement for just about a year, he never let his guard down, even for a second. And even though he mostly traveled to some smaller colonies where he did some smaller jobs in order to buy some more fuel to his ship and even food and medical supplies. But he just wished that he could just simply stop being on the run all the time. And he knows not other than United Nations Space Command is his worst enemy. His worst enemy would have been Fire Team Osiris, which would have been United Nations Space Command's one of the top team to be able to track someone down. And after being on the run for just about a year, and as John one day was just flying through space, minding his own business, when suddenly his sensors detected a ship was approaching. And it has happened before. He did encounter some other ships in the area, in space, and sometimes it was just simply civilian ships that he made trading with, but this wasn't that. It was a military ship. But thanks to one of his works on the different planet, he managed to buy a new ship that was not a military class. So he thought maybe that they wouldn't recognize his ship as much as a target. But as the ship was getting closer, he immediately recognized that ship. It was Fire Team Osiris. But for some reason, he didn't felt the need of worry, because he wasn't using his old ship anymore. And now he has an old civilian ship. It wasn't even much classified as a military craft from the beginning. But they started attacking him, and even sent a message over radio saying that they know that it's John, and they have managed to track him down, because now they will be taken back to Earth for execution. So John immediately activated slip space generator in order to avoid being captured. But as his ship was entered the slip space window, one of Fire Team Osiris ships attack hit the ship's engine, but only that he was in the slipstream space window for a few seconds. just for barely a fraction of a second. He left it, and he was worried that the fire team of Cyrus would be right behind him. But as he looked at it, there were no ships in the area. How strange, he thought to himself, because he couldn't even travel that far in a slip space window, because he was only for just barely 1 or 2 seconds. And that would have been not enough time for even travel just 1 light year or so. But as he was just curious to wonder what happened, suddenly the ship's alarm went off, telling him there was a damage to the engine, and that one particular engine, slip space generator engine, had been damaged. And as the slip space generator was still powering up, and since that energy couldn't be released from the ship, it was building up in the generator, which were making him go critical for overload. And there was nothing like he could just eject the entire generator from his ship. And he tried to override the system and tried to do a manual shutdown. But it didn't work, because somehow most of the system had been fried. And he didn't have much time. It gave him less than a minute before the ship would have been exploding. So he immediately went to a small escape pod that was attached to the ship. He pushed some boxes in it, like food supplies, medical supplies, and even a rifle that he had. Just before then, he had another alarm went off. Apparently, the overloading went even faster, so now instead for just 1 minute, he had about 20 seconds. So he immediately went in the pod and ejected from the ship, and from a distance, he saw his own new ship completely vaporized. But that was not all. Somehow, a shock wave from the explosion pushed his pod and damaged it. And he did notice that there was a planet nearby, and the pod was approaching it. And the last thing he remembered is seeing a dense forest. But then it crashed. Only a couple of hours later, John woke up. He was at first at daze. He didn't know exactly what happened. After he sat up, he started to remember the overload of the ship, and then he realized. So he went to the pod and just to see what system was damaged or something. Communication was completely down. Sensors completely down. But at least one thing. As he looked throughout the window, it was a dense forest. So he knows at least this world was habitable. But now without the pod, he couldn't risk, even if the communication was working, he wouldn't risk to send out a distress signal. Because knowing that fire team of Cyrus wasn't even that far behind him, if they could somehow detect his signal, they would find him. So he decided to remain in the pod to figure out what to do. Because he didn't know which planet he were on. Because since the pod didn't even have any records, or basically the pod didn't even have that type of database on it. So he wouldn't even know exactly which world he could be on. There was always a high risk that he could end up on a planet that has a strong military presence of United Nations Space Command. And he didn't know what to do. But after a couple of days, his food supplies, his rations, was gone. And he didn't want to just simply starve himself. But since this was a complete strange planet and he didn't know which one it was, even though thanks to his extensive training how to survive in the nature just in case if something would happen, but thanks to that, but also that he didn't know plant to eat. So he had to use his own rifle. So he went out in the woods looking for any animals to hunt. And he did find a smaller, like a deer-like animal, which he killed and at least had enough food for a couple of days by now. And he repeated this repeatedly for the next couple of days until he was out of bullets. Then he realized in order to survive, he needed to find something else. So he packed some of the food that he had managed to kill of the prey and of the medical supplies. He decided to just simply leave. He walked from the dense woods looking for any signs of habitation or even structures. He went through probably for at least a couple of days of this walking through the dense woods, sleeping under complete bare sky, eating what he got to eat, drink water from small streams and creeks, until he heard the sound of a voice, a woman, and he approached and saw it was a small camp. He saw there was a small ship that had been disguised by camouflage, and it was a young woman in. He assumed at least that he can assume that she was about in her early to mid-20s. She was accompanied by this strange robot, like a humanoid-shaped robot, and they were speaking a language that he didn't recognize. But then, he knows that there are a lot of alien worlds in the galaxy, and not all of them speaks English. And perhaps this could have been a such colony that they didn't have the language of English. But as he was closely listening to sound, or at least it's speaking, he didn't know what language it was though. But as he was listening, by accident, he stepped on a small twig which snapped. And this young woman noticed him. But before he could even anything to do, she ran up to him, holding some sort of strange weapon. It looked like it'd be a sword, but not a metal blade, but a laser. He had never seen or even heard of any such weapon technology before. She tried to talk to him, demanded to know who he is, but as he couldn't even could understand the language, and since he was wearing his helmet, only the helmet of his suit, she was like threatening him to take off the suit, at least the armor or something like that, to show who he is. And he removed the helmet slowly, and she saw that he was human. But that didn't even let her lower the weapon. That he tried to communicate with her, saying that his name is John, but somehow they couldn't even communicate. And as this woman called out for this robot, and somehow they communicated, and she then pointed at John to talk some more. And John tried to communicate with this robot and the young woman. But somehow the robot looked at her and said that some said something, and she was puzzled. And the robot somehow said something back to her, and she turned off this weapon. And she made a hand signal that he would come around and sit down next to the fire that she had made. John was really curious, but as he was sitting down, she heard his stomach growling, and then she handed over something for him to eat. He ate it, and it for some reason was actually good. But still, they couldn't communicate either, no matter what they did, how much they tried. And somehow afterwards, she even gave him a tour back to her ship, and pointing at some sort of a bunk, like a bed, which somehow he understand that he will let her stay there. But then she showed him her weapon and activated it once again as a signal, and he realized, if you do anything, I will have this hurt you. He just nodded, and this happened. For the next couple of days, they tried to communicate with each other. At first, it was almost impossible. But after only about a couple of days, John realized that he was starting to understand the language, which he later learned that was Galactic Standard Basic, and that her name was Dosira, and that the robot was called a droid. And now at least they kind of understand what they were, how they could make a full sentence to each other. But after about another week, he could understand her language fluently, and she could understand some of his language, at least was on a basic. And he had told her all his story. And at first, she had told some of the things about her, like that she is a Jedi, and that she served an order that was peacekeeper in the galaxy. And she told him that she had never heard of anything like called the Covenant before, and never heard of those worlds that he mentioned. And the same thing for him. He had never heard of some of the worlds that she talked about. And the droid had made suggestions. What if that he was actually not from their galaxy, but he was from another galaxy, but perhaps a galaxy but in another dimension? Based on what he described what happened, the droid had only that as some form of explanation. And John was very curious to know more about this Jedi, especially the weapon. He asked her if he could try it, even though that was a Jedi's most primary weapon, and they shouldn't just let it out to anyone. But now Dosira could trust him, because it turned out she was afraid that he was a stormtrooper from the new Galactic Empire, and that he was just wearing a new type of armor based from what that she had seen before. But after that, she saw his face and realized that he was not one of those clones. But he didn't let her just not lower her guard down, because she thought maybe that he was a stormtrooper, but a regular human. But after realizing after some time, he wasn't. And in fact, he wasn't even from their own galaxy for another thing. So she let him use her weapon, even though that she realized he wasn't force sensitive. But after he used the weapon, she was actually surprised that he could actually handle her lightsaber, which she explained what was called. Then he asked her once why she was hiding on this planet if she is a Jedi, if she is a peacekeeper, and why she isn't back on the planet that the Jedi Order were. She explained that she had been living on this planet for just 10 years by herself. She wasn't even a full trained Jedi Knight. She was still a Padawan. She explained that the Padawan was an apprentice, and being in order to be a Jedi, a Knight, or a Master, you had to be getting through the trial of knighthood. And he asked why that hadn't happened, and why she had been living on this planet for 10 years, with the droid as only sole company. She explained, shortly before this big galactic war had ended, this is known as Clone Wars, the Jedi was declared as traitors to the Republic, which later to become the Galactic Empire. And all Jedi would have been executed. But luckily though, she wasn't along with any clone troopers at the time, because she was with her master. She had just left the planet while she were with her master, and her master sacrificed his life in order to save her. So, and luckily for this ship had the droid on it. And the droid couldn't even believe why the Jedi would even try to this. So, the droid and Dosira had to leave. They went to another planet which they knew wouldn't have any settlements on. They would remain there for 10 years. So she had been living on this particular planet since she was 16 and now 26. And he couldn't believe it. But he wonders if there could be other survivors of Jedi out there. She said it's possible, but she hasn't even tried to reach out to them, with the risk knowing that her signal could have been detected by the Empire and she could have been executed. Or worse, she could have been turned into Dark Jedi serving the Empire instead. Even though that John couldn't even understand the concept of the light side of the Force or the dark side of the Force, or mainly the Force itself. Even though she did show him have some rocks hovering above her in her hand and have things pushed away and lifted, it's still the understanding how this mysterious power. And when he asked, does everyone in this galaxy have this type of power? She just said no. Only certain people, but she said everyone has the Force in them, but only a certain people who has certain high enough number of midichlorians, small microscopic life forms that made the Force. The higher number they had, the stronger connection to the Force they have. So, John realized since he was not from this original galaxy or this universe, so it's possible that he didn't even have those midichlorians. And after a while, John and Dosira actually had got to know each other much better. In fact, they considered each other as friends. And John actually even trained her some of his military experience techniques. But after a while, he could sense that Dosira wanted to leave the planet, but he knows also the risk of her not being able to traveling around. He somehow managed to convince her to leave the planet, but also disguise herself not as a Jedi, but as just a regular person. Even though she didn't want to just abandon her Jedi ways, he told her she's not abandoning her Jedi path, but only disguising herself as a way of surviving. The droid actually agreed. It's a better way to just simply avoid being avoiding by the Empire's detection. Just dress as a normal person without using the lightsaber and mostly without using the Force at all. But she could use her training in while on board the ship. So after a while, Dosira was convinced, so they left the planet and traveled around. Even though she was always really worried that she would be detected. But it didn't. Thanks to John's extensive survival skills, they only went to smaller colonies that were smaller habitable planets would have small communities on. But after some years, they eventually learned that the Empire had fallen completely, and the Empire was gone, and now they had been replaced by the New Republic. And now with the Empire completely gone, Dosira didn't felt that she didn't have to be worried anymore. Not to be worried about being tracked down by the Empire. And around the time, John and Dosira actually have been in a relationship. And after this news of the Empire has been replaced by the New Republic, they decided to settle down on a planet. And Dosira knew exactly which one they could settle down on, which they did, and shortly after they settled down, they got married. And just barely 2 years later, Dosira and John had a daughter together, which turned out to be Force sensitive. They were just not worried enough that their daughter would be taken away by anyone. But it wasn't until like 2 years later after that when they learned they were expecting a son. Even their son was Force sensitive. But then, a number of years have passed, and a big news spread through the galaxy like wildfire. A new Jedi Order had been formed, by Jedi Master Luke Skywalker. And he made the news an announcement that any Jedi survivors that had been in hiding in the galaxy this whole time was welcome to join his new order and help it to rebuild and maintain peace in the galaxy. And since now that Dosira was still a Padawan, never been approached by to be as a Jedi Knight, and when John heard about this news, he encouraged her to go to join the order. And now that even though that their own kids was old enough to understand, and since she had been training her own kids some of the basic understanding of the Force, she actually very much happy accepted it. So she went to Yavin 4 herself with her two kids and started training. After about almost 2 years, she made herself as a full Jedi Knight. After reaching the rank of Jedi Knight, Dosira was really happy and that she was really glad to take in some of the students as her own Padawans, including her own kids. And she was also happy that the galaxy once again had the Jedi back to maintain the peace and balance. Not only that, she was also happy to have met a young man by the name John, and someone who actually treated her such kindness, and who protected her throughout the years before the Empire was fallen. She promised herself to always to keep him and her family alive, and also to make sure that the Jedi won't be gone again. And this is how John and Dosira found a true love, got a family together. The end.